So good evening and welcome to this edition of the CMI Arts Initiative program. So I just give you a little background. So I am Madhavan, I'm the director of CMI, and the Arts Initiative is something which has been active for about 10 years now. So Professor C.S. Seshadri, who was the founding director of CMI, always was keen that there should be activity in the humanities. But CMI is a small institution and we don't really have the capacity to have a full-fledged department or program in the humanities. So instead, we started this arts initiative, as I said, about 10 years back. So it's a mixture of different things. So we have some on-campus workshops, which may span 2 or 3 weekends. We have lectures, and we also have an arrangement with Sangam House, where we host 2 writers around this time of the year for about 4 to 6 weeks. They come and spend a residency at CMI. And thanks to COVID, we also discovered that we could have online sessions, which help because they reach out, of course, to a wider audience than could possibly come in person to CMI. So we have these going on throughout the year, and we try to announce them to everybody who's interested. So if you have heard about this, but you're not getting mail from us, do write to artsinitiative@cmi.ac.in, and we will add you to our announcement list. And with that, I'd like to welcome our guest for today, Arundhathi Subramaniam, and Shilata, who's going to be the host. And over to you, Shilata.
Thank you, Madhavan, and good evening, everyone. Hello, and thank you so much, Arundhathi, for being here with us this evening. I'll just start with a very brief introduction of Arundhathi. Actually, really needs no introduction. She's an award-winning poet, author of 13 books of poetry and prose, including the recent poetry volume, Love Without a Story, which I absolutely love. She also has, as you know, a book of essays on contemporary women on sacred journeys, Women Who Were Only Themselves, which is a book we are going to be talking about. Also, the anthology of Poetry Wild Women, which explores the voice of female mystics. Her other works include the acclaimed sacred poetry anthology, Eating God, and the best-selling biography of a mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life. Arundhathi has written extensively on culture, on spirituality, and she has worked over the years as poetry editor, cultural curator, and critic. And I really am so happy to have you here, Arundhathi. I mean, I really think of you as a friend and as a mentor in so many ways. So thank you once again for so readily agreeing to this evening's session. Today's session, Arundhathi will speak to us about the work that went into 2 of her most recent books, as I said, Women Who Were Only Themselves and Wild Women. The first is a book of essays which gives us a glimpse into the lives of 4 not that well-known female spiritual travelers. And it's really an inquiry, the author's inquiry, that binds it all together. Wild Women, as I said, is an anthology of poetry by, sacred poetry by women largely. So with that, once again, welcome. And let me start by actually asking you, drawing your attention to what you say in your preface, Arundhathi, preface to Women Who Were Only Themselves. You speak of your thirst for conversations with women spiritual travelers who are improvising, you say, as they go along, who are very much part of the spiritual landscape in India, but they are largely invisible. You speak of the quieter women who have not built institutions, the ones who don't have, huge number of followers and acolytes and devotees. And this sort of reminded me, and I think you mentioned that book as well, this reminded me of when I was a student and eavesdropping on the conversations around women writing in India by Susie Taru and K. Lalita. The book was actually taking shape when I was a student, and I remember being really excited by it, but also about like how challenging the project was. And this is a somewhat similar exercise, isn't it? So tell me, what did your search for these 4 very unusual women involve, given that it is so hard to find what you can't see? So how did this book with these 4 women come to be?
That's a wonderful question, Srilata. Just want to say I'm delighted we're having this conversation because it's in some ways, I think, long overdue. I'm very glad it's happening with you. And I want to thank Madhavan for making this happen too and making it possible. I'm actually glad we're starting with that question, and I'm so happy you invoked the Susie Tharu K. Lalita anthology because in so many ways for us, and I think people in our generation, it has been a companion for decades. Now it's been decades. And it's been there, it's been a presence, it's been a book we return to, and it has been very significant. At one point in my life, when my spiritual journey took on a certain intensity and became a more conscious journey, I started veering away from a lot of the literature I had read earlier simply because it wasn't satisfying the thirst that you mentioned. There was a thirst to read about spiritual travelers. And I was an omnivorous reader. I was ready to be surprised. I was willing to take crumbs from whatever source it came from, as long as it nourished me in some way. I was that desperate a seeker, let's put it. I, by that time, foregone some of my intellectual arrogance, which I had in plenty in the past, I think. And I was really looking. So when I was looking, I was nourished by all kinds of narratives. And I talk of all the male mystics, even in the preface to this book, all the male mystics and gurus, from the more recent ones to the ones of the past, from Meister Eckhart to Ramana Maharishi, many, many who have nourished me, and St. John of the Cross, whose canticles came to my aid at one point in my life, many people, living and dead, who have helped me enormously. And a lot of my writing then began to center around the sacred and the notion of the sacred. The Book of the Buddha happened with Penguin at that time, the biography of Sadhguru, and so on. But somewhere along the way, I realized that what I had thought of as an earlier journey, which was my own curiosity as a reader of feminist literature and as a woman seeking to hear women's voices, that curiosity returned. And I realized that for all the reading that I was doing, and I'm also a spiritual practice of my own, all of which has been vital. But that's when I realized that I have actually been sustained over the years by so many wise women. And why is it that those voices don't seem to leak in to writing, to spiritual literature? Why am I not hearing those adequately? And I think that's when it started. Yes, in Eating God, which is a book and in Wild Women, where I'm so delighted to have used your translations of Subramania Bharati's goddess poems. In both these books, certainly in the latter, there are many, many women. In the former, there are women too. But who are these women? You have Mirabai and Akkamadevi and Andal, many of whom I had grown up hearing. They were not new to me as, names. They were very much around. Their work was part of my oral landscape. I'd heard their poetry, the music that came out of their poetry lent itself to. But what I think I missed was a sense of flesh and blood women. What I heard in these renditions were beautiful, decorative, sentimental, lyrical, swooning women. The kind of, they did all the things that medieval women were supposed to do. They swooned and they were lyrical and they were dulcet and pretty. But I didn't hear the fierce appetite for something more, which I know is an integral part of a spiritual journey. So I think it was the need to tune into that.
Right.
Quite a deep.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, so in what way do you feel that in what way are female mystics different from male mystics? It's a very straightforward kind of question, but I was really curious to know what you found in the course of the work that you put into the book. I mean, apart from the fact that, of course, women mystics are lesser known, that's another matter entirely. And I was also, of course, thinking of Sadhguru. You have a best-selling biography of his life and so on. And you do consider him your guru. So did you feel that this journey into the lives of female mystics was that very different from that other journey?
Well, I'll say that one thing I did realize somewhere along the way is that the fundamental journey is an inner journey, and all these are sources of inspiration more than anything else. But they're also reminders of a journey that has been made before, where you're not alone. And, people go on about, especially in the spiritual, when it comes to the spiritual journey, people go on about how it is gender neutral. And I found when making that journey myself that I would have been, actually, it would have helped a great deal to have heard more about women on this journey than I was given access to. It would have helped a great deal, not just to see them as these kind of calendar art images, not just these plaster saints who seem to have just been born with this transcendent love of, some absentee male god, but those who struggled and faced their share of conflicts, but also found ways to reclaim themselves. So I'll give you a very, an example that actually made a great deal of sense to me when I first came across it. I was in my teens, Srilata. I was in college. And I remember reading this book by a Christian feminist theologian, Valerie Saving Goldstein, who says that why is it, that every tradition talks about surrender. The very word surrender when it comes to women is a loaded word. So she points out that when we're constantly talking about surrender, what does it mean? What does it mean for a woman to surrender an identity that she has never really valued in the first place? What is the value of that surrender? Now that question stayed with me. And as my own journey deepened, I began to ask myself, what is surrender? What is bhakti? That was my central question in Eating God. And I think the introduction in some way returns time and again to the fact that it is not a submission to authority. Unfortunately, the word bhakt is being used all the time today in public discourse, And I think it's a very unfortunate choice of word because there is nothing docile, nothing meek, nothing unquestioning about the bhakta. The bhakta is a passionate, sometimes argumentative, and often erotic poet, or a human being on a journey. And I think that aspect of bhakti I wasn't hearing adequately. So Eating God, the Penguin anthology of bhakti poetry, was an attempt to redefine in a way, or re-energize our understanding of bhakti. For women who wear only themselves, and with Wild Women, the new anthology, I think what I was looking for is, one, to look at this idea again of surrender, and it's an overused, very loaded word that I really think we need to examine deeply, because it suggests that the deity is a despotic figure, and the deity never is in sacred poetry. It also suggests that the bhakta is some kind of spineless figure, which the bhakta never is. So that brings me to the second point, that we often think of bhakti or spirituality in any form as a kind of subduing of the self to the point when we become spineless virtually. You become this little puddle at the feet of the divine. But the finest poems I found as I was reading them, the finest poems reminded me that it's not about losing your spine, it is about reclaiming spine. And I felt that needed to be, retrieved. I needed to retrieve that. That it is about reclamation of self, retrieval of self, not about becoming a groveling, cringing, submissive human being. Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I think that's the fear that sometimes, so many of us have, no? That it just means you've got to sort of give up on everything and give up on your self-respect and just sort of fall at that person's feet. But I think this is a very interesting way of really thinking about it. Right. So, so two of the four women in women who wear only themselves are actually, you say they're part of your inner circle, right? One, of course, is Lata Mani, who's a cousin of yours and also an academic. The other is Ma Karpuri, your sannyasi friend, and you talk of her as a force of nature. I must say that my own personal favorite among these four women is Lata Mani, because I knew her as an academic and have always found her transformation following that terrible accident that she had, which left her immobilized and in pain and so on, very, very fascinating, that sort of transformation. And of course, I think she somehow seems to me and to many of us, she is like one of us who is suddenly not who we thought she was, right? And Lata also speaks maybe a slightly different language from the other three women, doesn't she? So she speaks of that feeling of irrelevance, of not fitting into this whole busy, hyper-productive world because she's so ill, so chronically ill. And there is that connection she makes between, or you make, I think, in the book, between the mystical and the traumatic life experience. So I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, and what did it mean for you to have two of those four women, in the book, actually part of your life in that very, like you just knew them, and maybe you knew at least in the case of Lata, you knew who she was before she became this Lata. No?
I did. Initially, Sri Lata, the book didn't even have these two women. I just started working on the other two essays about these two women I had met, Annapoorani Amma and Balarishi. And I felt the need to talk about them because they were so extraordinary, so obviously extraordinary. It was as I started putting those essays together that I realized, why am I leaving out people whose voices have also been very important to me? Do I need to leave them out simply because I know them? And I realized that would be a grave mistake. And that's how these entered the book. And I'm so glad they did. And I really wanted it to end with Makadpuri because I wanted the intimacy of that friendship in some way to come into the picture. Because, even in the Dalrymple book, 9 Lives, the one that made the essay that had the deepest impact on me was the one between the Jain nuns and the friendship between these two women.
Right.
And I think I wanted in some way to suggest the importance of female friendship. And that's why I had to end with the Makadpuri portrait. But when it comes to Lata, there are many people who feel very drawn to that portrait, but those are the people who are usually with an intellectual or an academic background. So I'm very glad to be discussing Lata again because she matters a great deal to me too. But I will say that it depends on one's orientation, really what one is drawn to, which of the 4 women one is drawn to.
Yeah.
There are some who are very drawn to Annapoorani Amma, the very first woman mystic, who has this kind of crazy ecstatic quality.
Yeah.
I think ecstatic traditions can be sometimes more unnerving than contemplative traditions. So it's almost easier to gravitate towards the contemplative rather than the ecstatic. But the interesting thing about Lata is while she is an intellectual, she is also very deeply a bhakta. And to me, this combination is one that I perhaps on some level recognize because I feel very pulled to the life of the mind, but I also feel it was a revelation to me as my own journey unfolded, how deeply I am in fact a person who needs to reside in the heart. And I need to take a lot of my decisions from that space within the self. Of course, it's a dramatic journey. Lata's journey is dramatic because it starts with this woman, a Marxist feminist, that kind of person of that background, a very reputed scholar, whose life very literally turns upside down. Anyone on any spiritual journey, and here you don't have to have had Lata's experience to know it, but anyone recognizes this upside downness. Upside downness in some ways is almost an inevitable phase in the spiritual journey. In Lata's case, it happened horrifically, dramatically, because here she was driving to work. It was just a day like any other. And she collides with this Pepsi truck, I think. Is it a Pepsi or a Coke truck? I forget. Anyway, she collides with this truck and her life is never the same again. She's plunged into this traumatic phase of her life with this head injury when she's just consumed by pain. Nothing from her earlier life can virtually can endure with this kind of pain. And that goes on for years. And it is in that phase of recovery that she begins to breathe into her pain. And in that upside downness, something begins to emerge. And that's the whole process where she is in touch with, in fact, the goddess. It's the goddess who comes to her rescue. So it's an interesting journey. I don't want to say too much. I don't want to say, everything about it, but I hope someone will pick up the book for that reason, and also for the sake of those other women. But to me, it becomes a very, very graphic and very alive illustration of this topsy-turviness of the journey, which is inevitable. In some way or the other, everyone knows it. Everyone who wants to come home knows some period of exile. It works itself out differently for different people, but everyone recognizes it.
Yeah, so I was wondering whether, maybe this is a good moment for us to pause and for you to maybe read an excerpt. And even though actually Lata Mani was, in a way, a favorite, because I just think I sort of said, oh, I didn't expect her to be in the book, first of all. And here is somebody I kind of knew in my own life as an academic, and there she was. But I did also find Annapoorani Amma very, very fascinating, right? And so, in fact, that was the excerpt I was hoping I could persuade you to read. I think it's somewhere on page 29 in my Kindle edition. Begins with
made a couple of hours ago where you'd suggested a particular.
Yeah,
and I was curious actually about the place you suggested, because it seemed like an interesting choice. Is there a reason why you asked me to read that?
I think it just sort of brings alive, firstly, I think it makes this very person who's like an outlier, no? She doesn't wear clothes and she's just sitting there, and she's obviously out there, no? Quite different from anybody else that we would know. But you have this conversation with her and she says things, and then she's just actually quite funny, and she's so she comes alive, and I think that's
She was completely disconcerting. She was funny and, completely unpredictable, really. That's what that encounter was like. I just want to say to those who are tuning in that those who don't know the book, that I wanted that sense of diversity, Srilata. I wanted one woman who's very much a person of the mind, Lata. I wanted someone who is as much a person of abandon as Annapoorani Amma. I wanted someone who was on this very disciplined path of Nada Yoga, like Balarishi, but who also talks about wanting a coffee with a friend in a local cafe and missing that kind of, they're very human in their own ways. I wanted a monk. I want, there she is wearing ochre, and there is Annapoorani Amma casting off all clothing. So they're just different kinds of choices. So when someone actually said to me, but aren't they all from the same, they all represent, they're all the same tradition. And that just took my breath away, because in fact, they are not from the same tradition at all. And this is the mistake we make in assuming that one religion, it means one tradition.
Right.
Fortunately, it's been standardized to mean that. They're, crazily diverse. But do you think it makes sense to read? I'll read an excerpt if you want. This is from Annapoorani Amma. This land is holy, unimaginably holy, declares Annapoorani Amma, her gaze moving rapidly across our faces. Is that the excerpt you wanted? Okay. She seems to be studying us, sizing us up. Her gaze is curiously personal and impersonal all at once. A dimple appears fleetingly in her cheek, reminding me that she must once have been an attractive woman. There are photographs of her around the hall that depict her in her youth at the shrines of various saints. She is pretty, glossy-haired in these. She is striking even today, but pretty is not the descriptor that she evokes. Indeed, she seems to be at pains to ensure that any idea of decorativeness is furthest from the mind. I am fleetingly reminded of a novel of my childhood and its figure of the mad woman in the attic, the archetype that women even today keep safely locked up. Unleashed from their psychological garrets, these energies can be decidedly unsettling for the world. And yet, one knows that the refusal to draw on these attic reserves can turn one into a limited version of oneself, often toothless, lifeless, insipid. Charlotte Bronte, that 19th century creator of the Mad Woman of the Attic, surely knew that too. There is something exhilarating about this presence before us. For a naked woman sadhu, I realize, the mad woman demeanor is probably both liberating and convenient. It keeps at bay the spiritual tourists and the curiosity hunters. Do you know my guru, Sadashiva Tata, she asks. We nod. He lived and meditated here for 25 years. Did you know that? How could it be anything but holy, she asks, rhetorically. I'm struck by the affection in her use of the epithet grandfather, Tata, to describe her guru. Her voice softens when she invokes him. But he's been gone for centuries. How did he become your guru? I ask. She turns to me. He called me, she says. He said, come on, my child. And so I did. She speaks in Tamil, but the words, come on, my child, are uttered in English. He speaks to you in English, I ask irrelevantly. She laughs. And why not? He does not belong only to this region. He belongs to the world. A guru needs no language.
Yeah, I like the way how how you figure in this thing as well. I mean, that whole question you ask her and how she responds to that. So thank you for that. Do you want to also read some of your poems at this point, Arundhati, or would you like to do that later? I was really thinking of the monk poem, but
how we whatever you like. If you would like, if there's something you'd like me to read, I'm happy to. If you'd like to continue talking, I'm absolutely
yeah. Maybe we will return to the reading in a while. So I'll just kind of move on a bit, and then we'll come back and maybe I would ask you to read a poem. So yeah, my question was also about what did you bring to the listening process itself? So what did it mean for you to listen to these women? What did that entail? And did something shift inside you as you heard them? How long did it take for you to process all of this, right? Because there is the chase. I mean, there is the trying to find these people and that journey for you. And once you sort of actually find them and decide, okay, these are the 4 people that I want to write about, there are these maybe sometimes fragmentary conversations over a period of time, and the writing it all down and the processing it. So was there a shift that happened, and how did that whole thing play out? And also, I think I was curious to know, did it sort of impact your craft as a poet at all?
Wow. To answer your last question first, I'd say my own journey has certainly impacted my life as a poet. Whether these particular women have, I don't know, but just like I don't know. But I will say that my journey in many ways has fundamentally affected me, and therefore it almost inevitably affected the poetry and shifted the way in which I approach the making of a poem. That I know has changed. Right. I can see the difference, and I can feel the difference when I read a poem. So that has shifted.
But how so? Sorry, I mean, I want to just probe a little. Yeah. How so?
I'd say that it's really, Srilata, when I began to discover that a spiritual journey was not just about the books I read or the amount of information I collected, even about reading the mystics. It's not about all of that, though I have read desperately and urgently and widely. But it has really been about having a practice, a daily practice, because that for me over a period of time was, I think, transformative, truly transformative. So I think because the way I breathed changed, I changed, therefore the work changed. I feel the poems become much more porous. When I say porous, I don't necessarily mean that they become easy to access as much as I feel there's a lot more breathing space on a page, and the way I approach what people would just consider to be, what I considered to be a matter of craft, which is just line lengths, visually mapping a poem. I approach that whole process differently now because I breathe differently. Right. So I think that's where the change happened in the form of the poem. But to go back to your question about listening, I love the question, because if I were to say, what my fundamental self-definition is, Srilata, I'd say I see myself, this doesn't make for good stuff on bio notes, but essentially I see myself as a listener. That's what I am, whether it manifests in a poem, or whether it manifests as as prose, or whether it just manifests as nothing, it doesn't manifest at all. I'm essentially a listener. And I think, like many women, perhaps, one thinks of listening as a kind of passive process. And this goes back to your earlier question about what is it about women mystics and their journey that's different. And I'd say this is it. We are encouraged to believe. I was also one of these who believed that all those poems I had read about waiting women, dance has been an important part of my life, and a lot of the sacred erotic poetry in dance from Jayadeva and innumerable other padams and so on down the ages have had waiting women. And I was impatient as a young viewer of this, as a young practitioner. I was impatient with these waiting women because they all seemed to be waiting for this God who never appeared. Or if he appeared, he was unpunctual and he was always unfaithful. So what was this waiting about? Why couldn't these women get a life? That was my question. And I think it has taken me my own journey. And of course, the conversations with women such as these, to realize that waiting and listening are not passive processes. They are active, they are dynamic. Dayabai, who's an 18th century woman mystic poet who's in Wild Women, the anthology that's to come out next month. Dayabai says, I'm a warrior. She talks of herself as an acrobat girl, who watches her every breath as she leaps from one breath to the other. This is an alert warrior. This is not a passive swooning naika. So to realize that listening is a dynamic process, it's an alert, it's about receptivity, not about passivity. I think this to me was an important personal realization. And I think that's the shift that has happened for me, and certainly it was mirrored in these conversations.
So the book speaks, I think, not just to those who are on spiritual journeys, but also to folks who are on all other sorts of life journeys, right? To people who feel a calling that's perhaps quite different from what the world expects them to do, or even the dictates of their present circumstances. So I was just wondering if people sort of, when I read the book, that was one of the first things that came to mind. And I said, yeah, it speaks to me very differently. I wouldn't see myself as a spiritual, as someone on a spiritual path necessarily, but maybe I am on that path and I just don't label it like that. Aren't we all in some ways?
Path of self-retrieval, anyone on that path.
Anyone on that path. Yeah.
Discuss self-retrieval. I think it hopefully will speak to them.
Yeah. So have you had people saying that to you?
I haven't. The interesting thing, Srilata, is when men say it, because again, when we talk of women's journeys, we think that the readership has to be women. So we say one is spiritual seeker, and it's only one kind of person it is meant for. In fact, as you can see, none of these women are sanctimonious. So if you have any kind of dogmatic idea of the spiritual, you're going to flout it. Every woman, every reader of this book has told me, but that woman, she's the real one. And I always want to say each one of them can be real. It's just it just requires you to acknowledge that there are multiple paths and multiple ways of being human. So that's one part of it, that it compels one to extend one's understanding of what the spiritual is. So yes, there have been people who found these characters and just found themselves fascinated either by the person or, as you point out, by just the fact that we are all trying to make sense of our lives in some way, and just helps to know that there are different ways of doing it.
Right.
The other thing, though, is the male readers. And one of the most moving for me was a person who found his way all the way to Makarpuri, the monk in the book, and sat before her. He had no clue of, how to get to her, finally found a way, contacted her, went all the way and met her in her ashram and sat before her. She thought he wanted to be guided around the ashram. He wasn't interested in any of that. He did all that, but he said, it's you I want to talk to. And she didn't know why. And then he pulled out this book and he sat before her and talked about his life and wept. And that was when she told me about it, it was the beginning of my understanding of how much everyone, male or female, everyone deeply thirsts for a less lopsided spiritual heritage, a less lopsided way of looking at this business of living and making sense of it, you know. And I think it was important for him that he was talking to a woman. You know, he needed that.
Right.
And he could cry the way he did because she was a woman. And of course, she was a monk. But it touched something.
Yeah. So, so one of the key points that you make in the book is that, I mean, through the lives, the stories that you describe and document, is that this awakening or the spiritual awakening is not just some sudden like bolt of lightning or a sudden aha moment or whatever, but basically that it's a very gradual deepening realization, right? And but actually many stories, in fact, most stories one hears, including first-person accounts I've heard myself, are of the bolt of lightning kind of awakening, right? Suddenly the shackles just fell from me. I mean, I've heard people say this. And do you think that is never how it is? And that is always this deepening realization?
That's a good question. Yeah. No, I think it's both, Srilata. I don't think it's, in fact, there are some, Annapoorani Amma and so on, she may have had a certain orientation from the start, but, you know, for many people, there are these really moments that are turning points.
Yeah.
I think it happened that way for Lata. It's a turning point.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to also mention, which I do in the introduction, that for some people, it's a gradual process. And often even a turning point, I mean, I've had a turning point in my life, probably you have, and everyone has, where something fundamental seems to turn. But after that comes the whole process. You know, an awakening can happen to many people. But how do you then live? How do you make sense of it? How do you integrate this into your life? That's another whole journey. You know, that's another whole journey unto itself. And I don't think anyone can quite step out of that, you know. So there are different, it happens either as a thunderbolt for some, but even then I think there's a process of integration that is almost necessary to happen after that.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So in your, I mean, you did speak about it briefly earlier, but in your preface to your biography of Sadhguru, you, I think I remember you describe your skepticism. You say something about, I think, gurus, you always assumed that gurus wouldn't happen to urban women or something, and you speak of your intellectual arrogance and things like that. And yet, of course, at some point, you know, you're sort of cracked open. But, you know, right now, given the very difficult circumstances we have, this often has the effect of putting many people off any talk of God or of God-men. And it actually seems really hard, if not even impossible, to consider a spiritual direction. So these two books have actually arrived at a moment like this, right? So how would you place these books, your work, maybe your larger life as a seeker? How would you sort of convince people of the necessity of or the importance of a healthy spiritual ecosystem, and one that kind of balances out the sacred with the secular, right? So because, I mean, I think all of this involves a certain nuanced understanding and also the patience to sift the chaff from the grain and not to just sort of tar everything with the same brush, right? Yes. So how do you think you can avoid that? Like, are you even trying to do that? I mean, it comes alive, it comes through in your writing, you know, but yeah, but generally in terms of how you would be received or people who have not read the books or something.
You know, maybe something that you said made me want to open Women Who Were Only Themselves, the book, to this particular paragraph. Maybe because I feel in this paragraph, or these two short paragraphs, I talk about the way in which what I see as the connection, you know, between what we are often encouraged to see as mutually exclusive, impermeable categories, the sacred and the secular. Yeah. And this idea that you become this, as I said earlier, some submissive acolyte if you turn sacred, or else if you're in the secular world that you have to be this blistering rationalist. Most of us are neither, you know. Most of us are neither. We're a bit of both at different times, right? But this belief that we have to masquerade as one or the other, I think is part of the problem. So yes, in the introduction to the Sadhguru book, I certainly talk about having to come out of the closet as a seeker, come out of the closet to myself, first, and then to the world. But I also go on to say, yes, while this journey is one of increasing vulnerability, and you're aware of that vulnerability when you're living it, because the heart is a dangerous place to live. And especially if you have a strong bhakti orientation, that's really where you're invited. And it's a place that it's risky to be there. It's not a comfortable place to be all the time. It's rewarding, but it's not comfortable. So there is that vulnerability. And at the same time, the strength that emerges from that vulnerability is the strength I'm talking about in these women. Strength that comes not from easy stances and positions, but the strength that comes out of actually having connections with, where your head is connected to your heart, not separate from it, where the rest of you, your body and your mind and your spirit in some way are acknowledged. When you acknowledge all of that, that acknowledgement itself makes, to my mind, for a much truer definition of power, not the more cosmetic definitions that we are encouraged to buy into. So maybe I should read this particular paragraph I'm talking about. I say in the introduction, the terror of uncertainty is more blazingly evident in our world than it has ever been. To carve a path between the certitudes of a frozen faith and the dogmas of arid materialism can be challenging. I marveled at how these women held their own in a world so conceptually fragmented, a world that divides the material and the spiritual into such impermeable categories. How did these women tune into their own inner guidance? How did they come to terms with that simple but oddly elusive truth that we are both flesh and spirit, that we do not have to simply masquerade as one or the other? Above all, how did they find their freedom in a world where the spiritual ecosystem is particularly hard to find? What is a spiritual ecosystem? Someone once asked me. One where spiritual seekers aren't apologetic about who they are, I said, where they're encouraged to explore, to question fearlessly, where they are not bullied by purveyors of faith into conclusion, or by votaries of reason into a knee-jerk scorn for anything beyond the ken of their rational minds. One in which the inner journey is not seen as escapist, but as enriching, both for the seeker and the world that she inhabits. I think that's perhaps the answer to your question.
Yes. Okay, so maybe we should actually move to Wild Women, the book that is sort of just out, but it'll only be available in March, I believe. So I was wondering if you could tell us something about the making of that book and maybe conclude with a reading of a few poems from it. I don't have a copy, so I would like to ask you to...
let me just hold up the book for those who, it's out, it exists, it will be out. As you know, Srilata, we did there was a session at the Jaipur Fest, but those were the advanced copies, and we'll have more copies out later. But I think I've covered a lot of the terrain, I think in discussing the earlier book, I've covered a lot of the terrain about why this book happened. For me, it was have to, because I was actually working on Wild Women, and these 4 essays about contemporary women came and derailed that. But I see now when I look back on both books, it's the same project.
Same project, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
These are 4 contemporary women. Those are women who've existed, and we've known of some of them, never known of the others, undocumented women. So for me, just to hear their voices again, to me was the spiritual equivalent, if you will, of or the sacred poetry equivalent, if you will, of the Suzy Tharu and K. Lalita project in some way. Just an attempt to offer them the simple respect of attention. They've just been overlooked or else trivialized. To me, these are the 2 options that seem to exist. Either we just sanctify these women into such states of exalted specimenhood where they lose all individuality or character. They become bloodless, they become anemic, they become unreal. Or else we just turn them, we just forget them because they're irrelevant. I mean, why on earth should we be listening to Soirabai or Janabai or, who are these women anyway? What difference did they make to our lives? So I think poetry makes all the difference to our lives, and just hearing them makes a difference. Let me read you a poem by Janabai, who is a 13th century Marathi woman mystic, translated here by Arun Kolatkar. She says, God, my darling, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law. I will feel lonely when she is gone, but you will be a good God, won't you? And kill my father-in-law. I will be glad when he is gone, but you will be a good God, won't you? And kill my sister-in-law. I will be free when she is gone. I will pick up my begging bowl and be on my way. Let them drop dead, says Jenny. Then we will be left alone, just you and I. Since we don't have much time, I thought I'd choose one particularly sassy poem, simply because it's a reminder of, the fact that there's a certain kind of feistiness that, didn't come to us only in the 20th century. It didn't come to us only from, the models of Western feminism. There was this kind of sass as well. And of course, it's a much deeper journey than that, right? She's only articulate. I mean, these are not necessarily women who went out and killed people, but they're women who were willing to articulate inconvenient sentiments, and that is also part of the journey of independence and finding your voice. So that's just a little flavor, a taster.
Okay. Should we then throw open the conversation?
Would you like to read something, Srilata? Would you like to read your translations? Because I must just say, for those who, just as a brief introduction to Wild Women, most of it is women mystics, but there are two sections, smaller sections. One is on male poets who speak in the female voice and what that does to the timbre of their voices. And the other is goddess poems, because I wanted the women to be here, not just as seekers, but as sought, the sought. What happens when the woman is this exalted being in the poems? How does that shift the tenor of the poet's voice? So I wondered if you would read one of your translations.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I have this here. This is Parashakti Vanakkam from Panchali Sabadam by Subramania Bharati. Prayer to Parashakti. Out of one, the sculptor fashions a temple doorway step. The other stone he elevates with his artistry, turns it into God's image. O Mother of the universe, you who calls the shots, shaper of forms, to you I surrender. Come, chisel away at me. Sculpt me, Mother, into a skillful poet.
I think you should read one more.
Okay. Right. Okay. This is Mahashakti Vinnappam, an appeal to Mahashakti. Slaughter my desires, O creator of the world and all its beings. And if you can't, stop my breath, slay this body. And if you can't, still the thoughts that rise. Lift me up to a state of awakening. And if you can't, annihilate me. Free me from these bonds. And if you can't, rid me of life's heaviness. Infuse with clarity my being. And if you can't, destroy me. O Spirit who moves through everything, O Spirit who drives the world, tell me, must I spend my life mistaking the chaff for the grain? Tell me, will my heart know peace? Will I never be rid of this flaw, this ego of mine? Won't they melt and disappear, the lies, the guile? Mother, tell me, won't they overflow, those tears of devotion? You who flood this world with your compassion, won't you grant this dog this much? Won't you fulfill its petty desires? O Spirit indescribable, that which flows through everything, won't you?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is such an integral part of this book, you know. I'm very grateful that you agreed to do those translations.
You want to stop with the reading of The Monk?
Ooh, that's a leap to my own poetry from one Subramaniam to another. That's a bit of a leap, but I could, but unless there's anything else, how are we doing for time? Should we just?
Yeah, we do have another 10 minutes. I guess we could extend it slightly. I mean, it's.
Yeah, no, we don't need to. But I'm happy to read The Monk if you like. Is it a reason why you want me to read The Monk at this point? Because
Just
I was sort of stuck up with the goddess right now.
Okay, so you want to read something else? Do that. I think people can always pick up the book and read for later.
No, I'm just. I mean, there's not a particular poem I wanted to read as much as. I just wanted to say that I feel increasingly that there is such a need for. I felt this need to return to goddess poems simply because I feel, I mean, the goddesses were never lost, but they seem to be emerging in a particular way right now in our world. The very fact that we're talking as we are, the sacred feminine, what is it? There was a time when we'd have also been mildly embarrassed to be talking about it, and I myself would have been amongst those. And I'm also very aware now that even this phrase can turn into an easy cliche. So we have to navigate it with care, aware of that. But I will say that somewhere there is a recognition, or I believe there is a recognition, that cultures or societies that are learning the importance of valuing plurality will in some way feel the need for goddesses again. Because the goddesses start returning when we open up to plurality, because they are representative of so many aspects of creation. And as soon as we're looking for some kind of unidimensional, singular idea of the divine, often male and territorial, but we don't need to go into the details of that. We know it only too well. As soon as we start looking at that, the goddesses almost seem to thin away. They're no longer around. But as soon as we start celebrating some of the great, messy multiplicity of this world, we can't do without the goddesses. They bring in a particular vitality and energy and singularity that we recognize. I think this, for me, was my recognition of, was an important recognition, Srilata,
Right.
Which is why your poem moves me as much as, your translation moved me as much as it did. Because when I first went into this particular goddess shrine and sat there, I just thought it was an idea that appealed to my ideology, appealed to me ideologically as some kind of, if there's a male god, there must be a female god kind of thing. Nothing more than that. But marinating in that space, I think I realized that there is something deep about the goddess archetype that speaks to us, and we recognize it. We don't even have to be introduced. We recognize it, and the realization that especially the goddess is an invitation to, she's both, you reach her through her, she doesn't allow you to live with these binaries of, devotee here and goddess up there. She is creation, and she is the bridge between creation and creator. So she becomes I think, she is this singular and universal presence all at once. I think that for me is what the goddess is. That's what the sacred feminine is.
Right. Okay, so should we then throw this open for questions, and maybe people can pick up?
There are any other people around?
Yeah, there are 40 people around, 41 people. Shabnam, you had a question?
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have some observations followed by a question. In pre-literate societies, trial by ordeal was a kind of initiatory ritual. And, after having disdained the seeming barbarism of this for many years, I've come to realize that a spiritual coming of age, in fact, involves some kind of dark night of the soul. It could be a grief, which induces a kind of sensorial mutiny, or it could be semantic muteness, something like what you experienced, Arundhati, or it could be material scarcity that eventually brings on a spiritual abundance, paradoxical as that may sound. And I feel some people are more predisposed to this. Recently, a lot of us experienced that in the Grammy Awards when Tracy Chapman emerged from her reclusive existence to sing, and she exuded a kind of stillness and radiance and seemed to awaken that in her audience. And there was sacred secularity to that kind of experience. And in a way, that's what I see in you, Arundhati. There's a certain presence, a certain gravitas, and a certain spiritual acuity that comes from the nourishment that you get from quietude. In fact, I feel that's where the two of us maybe connect. And I also feel there's a circularity in some connections that happen, which bring on an evolutionary growth in people. It expands, to use Robert McFarlane's phrase, your beinghood. And coming to my question, pardon me if it sounds a little sassy, actually. Did you see your own arrivals mirrored in these women? Was there a degree of projection, aspirational longing? Was there a part of you that couldn't be objectified in the framework of language that you found echoed in their demeanor?
Thank you. Thank you, Shabnam. I just want to say I couldn't agree with you more about, the kind of the shamanic sickness it's called. It's a period of purification that seems almost inevitable for most people. It's been called various things, whether it's an initiation or the dark night of the soul or whatever, or what I said earlier, that there can be no homecoming without exile. I think many of us recognize that and have been through it, which is why, what Srilata said earlier today too, that, we may not articulate these necessarily as spiritual journeys, but there are moments of recognition. And it's with those moments of recognition that something starts deepening. And that's when many of these figures come back as great archetypes and you realize, oh my God, that's what they were about. We read about them as characters, often cameos in literature. And suddenly, as one's own journey deepens, one recognizes the grandeur of the archetype that they represent. About these women and what they meant for me, were there moments of kinship, recognition? Certainly. I would say that this was the aspect that I recognized, the fact that there is almost always and inevitably this shock of awakening of some kind, which often just seems like a plunge into the unknown. The sense of being bewildered. To me, if I were ever to say, where does my tribe lie? I think many of us grow up looking for our tribe. Where are my people? For a while one thinks poets are one's people if one is a poet. Or one thinks, people with a particular political orientation are one's people. We all have different ideas of a tribe. Some people think their club is their tribe. Whoever. I think for me, I would today define my tribe as those who know what it is like to be stunned into silence at some point, and who've known that, and for whom it has been transformative enough to leave an impact on who they are. That's the fragrance of their being then. They've known that. They know what it's like to be bewildered, and they know what it's like to not have language.
I think, Mohit, you had a question?
Yeah, hi, Arundhati. My question was, how easy or difficult was it for you to reveal yourself through your work, especially because you're coming from academia and there are stigmas, etc. there is something fundamentally shifting in your own model of reality, in your own truth. So to express that, even as you're writing about others, you are revealing something about yourself. So yeah, how and did you hold back? Yeah.
Oh, it's a good question. Mohit, I thought I was not in academia. I thought I'd already moved away from that quite early in my life. But you're absolutely right. As in, I lived in particular circles where it was not kosher to be talking about, one's secret reading habits, which actually were all about all the mystic poets I was desperately reading and the other mystics that I was reading. It was not kosher to talk about that at all. I could only talk about the new novel I had read or the new modern poet that I was reading. These were not the things one discussed. I think I was, there came a time in my life, as I said earlier to Srilata, there came a time in my life when I was compelled to come out of the closet as a seeker. I thought I could live my life in neat compartments because I believed that the spiritual life was about neat compartments. I thought meditation is something you do quietly in your room, for God's sake. Right? It is, of course, something you do quietly in your room. What I had not realized is how explosive life journeys can become, where you can't live with all these within all these easy compartments that one is encouraged to live in. That I wrote about it in a poem. I said it was like opening a coffee percolator and finding my roof flying off. When your roof flies off, you have really no choice but to acknowledge that you need help, you need guidance, you're vulnerable, and you're scared. And I think acknowledging that in some way was transformative for me. And it was almost inevitable that it would leak into the writing, Mohit. It had to. It had to.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? You can also do questions in the chat box. There is one comment in the chat box by Samata. She says, good to see you all and to be part of the topic. I feel connected to the exploration of acknowledging women in mysticism.
Maybe we should continue talking if there aren't.
Yeah. There are no questions.
I can see something that says someone is writing, but I don't know what that is. Okay, maybe we should just continue.
Yeah. No, I was actually wondering, then do you want to just actually read a poem from your Women Who Wear Dresses, one of your poems? It need not be the monk poem. There is something else that you like, the textile poem also.
Okay. I'll read the monk since that's the one you asked for first.
Yeah.
Okay. The monk, who's been in silence 16 years, writes me a note at a yak tea stall, skirted by ragged prayer flags in a grey hiccuping wind on the road to Kailash. His face is scarp and fissure and gleaming teeth. He spends each day cleaning his shrine. It's worth it, he laughs. I clean the shrine, it cleans me. He was a spare parts dealer in a time he barely remembers, before he was tripped up by something that felt like a granite mountain in reverse, the deepest pothole he'd ever known, too deep to be called love. That turned him into a spare part himself, utterly dispensable, wildly unemployed. And if there is another lifetime, this is what I'd ask for, he says. And now he doesn't laugh. Same silence, same cleaning.
Thank you. Thank you, Arundhathi. Yeah, Sharanya has left a comment in the chat box. She says, thank you for such a beautifully articulated conversation, Arundhathi. I hope this is not too personal a question, and I respect if you wouldn't want to respond in this forum. Would you be able to say a little more, less abstractly, about your own experience, about being stunned into silence and how you integrated it?
Hmm. Thank you, Sharanya. And okay, if I were to talk less abstractly about it, I'd say that I had always seen myself as a seeker, asking questions about, the fragility of forms and the perishability of life and all the things that we, all wonder about, love and loss and longing, nothing new about any of that. Nothing new about being a seeker either, but, I think I was an unconscious seeker, let's put it that way. But if I were to try and make this as concrete as possible, I'd say in the year 1997, sometime in March, I think, or March or April, I went through a period of what felt like death. And there was no explanation I had for it because I was not depressed. And I've known enough about, feeling blue. I can recognize what it's like to be melancholic or to be unhappy. I was returning from a particularly happy vacation in Nepal. And I was not unhappy, and I was not physically unwell either. In fact, I was quite well, doing rather well. I'd eaten pretty well in Kathmandu, and I wasn't sick. So I had no idea what this was about. All I knew is that I was terrified. And I watched my body darken, harden into almost a corpse-like state. It wasn't external, but it was happening. And I didn't know how to make sense of it. Nothing I had read, and I had done a fair amount of reading of spiritual literature by then, but nothing I had read prepared me for it. It scared the hell out of me. And what was scary is that there was no language for it. And I didn't have the language to express this. So it lasted about a week. And all I remember of that week is great terror. But when I started coming out of it, suddenly life felt more alive than ever before. I was also coming out with great gratitude because it was good to be returned to this world as I knew it. But when I returned, I also knew that I couldn't live my life the way I had lived it before. That I had to address what had happened because it felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. Anything. In fact, it made everything else seem hollow. It made everything else seem essentially empty. So the only places, that I could turn to where it seemed to have been articulated in this way were, in fact, many of the Buddhist writings. That's the only thing that seemed to come close, this great sense of emptiness, existence from which all meaning has been gouged out. That's how it felt. But so I became a seeker. I became a very desperate and undignified seeker. So to go back to what the earlier questioner Mohit was saying, it was really about dropping a lot of one's of the cargo of one's identity as a particular kind of person, and just acknowledging that I needed answers, I needed guidance, and so I became. I looked very desperately for guidance for 7 years, and then I met. My spiritual guide happened, and life shifted in a certain way, and those felt like 7 terribly long years. And that was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. I hope that's less abstract.
I'm just curious what those 7 years looked like or felt like. I mean, you don't have to answer that if you can't, but.
I'm sorry, Srilata, I couldn't hear you.
No, I'm saying I'm just very curious what those 7 years must have felt like to you. It's a long time to.
Yeah, they seemed like they seemed endless years, and they seemed. I mean, I was completely functional on the one hand. I was living my life, earning my, keep my livelihood was underway. I was functional, but I was desperately seeking, and I was floundering. Because I needed something that helped me understand what had happened.
Other questions? Anyone? Yes, I think Urna, you have a question.
Yeah, hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Arundhati. We met in Bombay, and I love that line. I clean the shrine, it cleans me. You bring alive the reciprocity of practice and sustenance. I'd like you to talk about this practice. So of course, the sustenance of a spiritual practice, but there is also the practice of writing. I mean, or any other practice for that matter. Do you want to talk about that relationship? And if, kind of what does it mean to you personally?
I'm sorry, Uta, I'm glad, and thank you for asking the question, but I'm not sure I got it because your voice was breaking up. Srilata, do you want to did you hear
No,
it?
I didn't hear it too well either.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, this is...
Can you hear me now?
Maybe I should mute myself, I don't know. Because were you asking whether writing itself is a kind of practice? Is that your question?
Can you hear me now? Is it better now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I said, I clean the shrine, it cleans me. I love that line. And how beautifully you brought out the reciprocity between practice and sustenance. So there is the spiritual practice, which you talk about, and any kind of practice pretty much is a two-way street. And as writers, we know that, right? When you write something and put it out in the world, it's a two-way street. Like it's also doing a lot for you and you're doing for someone else. So do you want to talk about that reciprocity and in a personal way, in a writing way, whatever way that works for you? But do you want to talk about that relationship?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. And, in the way in which this particular monk speaks of it in this poem, it's, of course, about the most mundane activity, It's just cleaning. It's just the business of rolling up your sleeves and cleaning and the dailiness of it, And that's the reason for talking about 4 women as well here, largely unknown women, undocumented women. Simply because there is a quiet, most of our lives are led in this kind of dailiness. There is nothing heroic about it, nothing, dramatic and, nothing really considered worthy of being documented about it. But it's that dailiness in which a certain alchemy lies. And I think that's what the monk, to me, points out. That is, in that dailiness of that activity, something can shift. And yes, so he cleans the shrine and the shrine cleans him. The thing about writing, Urna, is it is absolutely the same. I mean, as you know, as a writer, it is alchemical. It can be deeply alchemical, as in you write, just the act of writing a page in your journal can be alchemical. You start writing with, in a moment of great rage. By the time you reach the end of the page, the rage has shifted. We've all known this. So we all recognize alchemy when we're cooking. I don't cook, but I know people who recognize it all the time. There's something different each day, even if you're following the same recipe, and something shifts. The thing with writing and publishing is that it can also, it can turn, it doesn't always, but it can turn into, for me, I realized, let me speak for myself. I realized for me, this could not be the only sadhana. It's an important sadhana, but it's not the only one. It's not the only spiritual practice that I can have, because writing has words and it brings me back to language, which I'm grateful for. But I also knew, particularly because I do write and I do read, I knew it was important for me to have a non-verbal spiritual practice. For me, that has been very important because it takes me away from the glibness that can sometimes come in when one is only seeking all the answers through language. I know personally that there was a time when the answers did not come. through language. Language deserted me. So I have to find another way. Language can be a great tool, but I also have to find other ways, other archaeological implements, as it were, to deepen my journey. So that's my way of doing it. And I must say, because you speak of reciprocity, there's a beautiful, couple of poems by Janabai, whom I read to you earlier, the 12th century. Janabai is a maidservant. That's what she was. She was a maidservant in the home of Namdev, who was a celebrated poet of his time. Janabai was just a maidservant. We know her caste and class antecedents were decidedly, she was nowhere on the top of the pecking order. But when Janabai is tired, she can send her God, her beloved Vitthala. She can send him to do the dishes. When Janabai is even more tired, Vitthala washes her hair. That's the kind of reciprocity that is possible between bhakta and God, where you realize that no one is servitor and no one is master. There is this wonderful dance of mutuality where both of them don't even know where one ends and the other begins. So for me, that is another kind of mutuality that, in bhakti poetry, whereas the monk, of course, comes from a more contemplative path, and karma yoga, that path of cleaning his shrine and being cleaned by it. So I love these examples of reciprocity, really. I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was such a beautiful answer. I'll take it back and keep it in my heart.
So there is a comment, and I guess also a sort of a question from Deepa in the chat box. She says, thank you so much for a fascinating insight into spiritual sojourn and the readings of the poems, which I enjoyed. I'm intrigued by the spiritual dimension in your poems. Also curious about being a seeker. I always thought poetry comes from stillness.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wish I could see this question because I'm sorry. Where is this question coming? Oh, I see. All right. Let me read it because I couldn't hear you.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the spiritual dimension, as curious about being a seeker. That's a lovely question. Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Deepa. And the thing is, I know that when I started out as a seeker, I always imagined myself in this I wanted this life of great serenity. I wanted to look serene, and nothing prepared me for the explosiveness of my own inner life. The fact that my emotions would now come to the fore in a way that I had not expected. I never expected the ferocity of certain appetites, the appetite for something more. I never knew bhakti, and that's why I wrote, I put together that entire anthology, Eating God. I never knew bhakti was such a ferocious business. I thought it was all about being calm and still, and looking tranquil in a corner, maybe even looking a bit like a cabbage, a sort of nice looking cabbage. I thought that would be the way it was. I did not expect this kind of, I didn't expect the roof to fly off and the coffee percolator's contents to go flying up, to a ceiling that never existed. So, which is really a way of saying that I think there is really no journey to stillness that does not in some way make its peace with all the tumult of our own interiority. You can't sidestep that. You can't bypass that. There's a reason why that phrase spiritual bypassing was coined, because we would love to bypass it, but we can't. At the most, we can create a certain bridge. And I realized gradually that is really what bhakti is. It's a disruptive experience, but it is also a very deep wisdom of the heart. It's based on the understanding that if you travel into every festering crevice of your heart and acknowledge what often seems to one as, mess or negativity or darkness, all those places that are not pretty, that are not easy to share with the world, But if we start entering those crevices and bringing a certain awareness and an acknowledgement of that, that's what the Bhakti poets do. They can rage at God. They don't pretend that they always love him. They love him or her, but they're also capable of being very angry. They're capable of rage. They're capable of passion. They talk to their gods about their deepest sexual desires. They're capable of making love to their gods. They're capable, as I said, in the title, they're capable of eating God or wanting to eat God. Those are the appetites they're acknowledging. They're acknowledging all those areas that we are otherwise encouraged to feel guilty about. And in the act of acknowledging it, something begins to shift. And that's when I began to realize, and that's the understanding even that permeates Wild Women, the new anthology, that the wild women are often the wise women, because it's after acknowledging all of this that a state of self-possession starts to emerge. The pining Naika, whom we've all encountered in poetry, the woman who waits, she's angry with the beloved who never appears. She grieves because he doesn't appear. She's jealous because he's with someone else. She acknowledges all those states, not nice states, not pretty states. But in acknowledging that, the seasons shift within her, and she is born into a new state of wholeness. And I like to believe that at the end of that, she doesn't really need that lover to appear physically anymore. She is complete now. So it's not predicated on someone out there. It is all the seasons that you're acknowledging within. That's really that's when the real stillness happens, I think.
There is one very general question by Avik, and I think maybe we should wind up after that. That's in the chat box as well, Arundhathi. So he asks, dear madam, why are strong and enlightened women rare in society? And then he has a few examples, and he says, even in other intellectual domains like science, maths, etc., the number of women is low when compared to men. What do you think the reason is behind this?
Well, it's Abik who asked that question. I think it's for, the reasons that perhaps, many of us know that even the wise women who existed were perhaps not the voices that were heard or the voices that were considered significant. They were often the voices that remained marginal, peripheral, shadowy, simply because we live in a world that hasn't taken women that seriously. So part of this project, Wild Women, was actually to take some of those voices seriously and to say, hey, we're going to stop and listen to them. I wish I could find, I'm just looking, and Avik, and for you as well as the earlier questioner, I just want to read this short poem by Nammalvar, the 9th and 10th century Tamil mystic, translated here by A.K. Ramanujan. And I thought I'd read him because when I first read Hymns for the Drowning, I felt I was drowning. So it was truly a book that rescued me. And here's the girl. This is a mother talking about her child, her daughter. This daughter has been transformed by this encounter with the sacred, the lover. Now you can read this as just a woman transformed by love, but I think it goes deeper than that, because what the mother here suggests is that this young girl has turned not just into a wild woman, she's turned into a wise woman. Hear her. This is the mother. She sounds incredulous. The mother doesn't know what's going on. She's utterly incredulous, but she's also, I think, proud. I can hear the pride in her voice. This is what she says. She says, my girl, who's just learning to speak, says, I'm beyond all learning. I'm all the learning you learn. I'm the cause of all learning. I end all learning. I'm the essence of all learning, says she. Does my girl talk this way because our Lord of all learning has come and taken her over? How can I tell you, O learned men? So it turns the idea of learning on its head as well, At the same time, this is a much deeper learning than any of those learned men probably possess. She also says, my little girl says, I've no relatives here, and everyone here is my relative. I'm the one who makes relatives relate, says she. I also end relations, and to those related to me, I become all relations, she says. Can it be that the Lord of illusions, beyond all relations, has come and taken her over? How can I tell you, my kinsman, what she means? So this is a state of possession, seemingly, by this Lord beyond everything. But this state of possession is also a state of absolute wisdom and freedom.
Right. I think we have
So I think are these voices, it's just that we're not encouraged to hear them very much.
Yeah, I think we have come to that point when we have to conclude, even though we don't want to. May I now thank you, Arundhathi. Big, great thanks from me personally. And I now hand over the session to Madhavan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Arundhathi, so much for this wonderful evening. And thank you, Srilata, for organizing it and for also conducting the conversation. And thank you all to the very large audience which came today to tribute to Arundhathi. I think that we had such a large turnout. And I hope that you will join us for future programs. And as I said before, if you are not on our mailing list, please write to us and we will add. Thank you so much and see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhavan. Thank you, Srilata. And thanks all of you who were here.